Following on from his father's work, Henry III spent a total of approximately £1,362 on the castle, including the upgrade of the keep. It was also Henry who ordered that the castle's keep to be whitewashed. This wasn't unusual for Henry, as he also instructed that the keep at the Tower of London to also be whitewashed. During the construction at Corfe, a camp to shelter the workers was set up just outside the castle. Over time this grew into a small settlement, and in 1247 it was granted a market with royal permission. This would of course be turned into the village that we see today. As well as castles being used for defence for the local area, most of them included a storage facility. Just before the siege of Bedford Castle in 1224, Henry came to Corfe to collect 15,000 crossbow bolts for the upcoming siege. In 1250, the gatehouse was built, whilst the outer gatehouse and southern Bailey towers were added in the 1280s. According to the information known, no significant historical incidents occurred at the castle during the 14th century, other than Edward's imprisonment. However, things started to pick back up again in the 16th century. In 1572, the last royal owner of Corfe Castle, Elizabeth I, sold the Isle of Purbeck and the castle to her Lord Chancellor, Sir Christopher Hatton, who spent a small fortune restoring and filling it with fine furnishings. His steward, Ralph Treswell, drafted a series of plans of Corfe, which would become the oldest surviving survey of the castle. In 1588, he would spend more money on strengthening the defences against what would become the Spanish Armada. After Christopher's death in 1591, all of his possessions, including Corfe Castle, were bequeathed to his nephew, Sir William Hatton. William would have to pay off his uncle's large debts. He would eventually clear the debts, although later in life he would also get into the same situation. William died in 1597. His wife, Elizabeth, who was the daughter of the politician Thomas Cecil, would also inherit Corfe Castle. She would remarry on the 6th of November 1598, a year after her previous husband's death, to the judge Edward Coke. When he died in September 1634, Elizabeth would sell off Corfe Castle and its associated lands, rights and privileges to a Sir John Banks. The Banks were a prominent family in and around Dorset for 400 years. In 1605, aged just 15, John Banks joined the Honourable Society of Gray's Inn, which was a society for barristers and judges. Around 1618, John Banks married Mary Hawtrey, the only daughter of Ralph Hawtrey, a magistrate. The Hawtreys were a prominent family dating back from the Norman invasion. Together, John and Mary would have 10 children. In 1624, John became a Member of Parliament, until 1629 when King Charles I decided to rule without Parliament for the following 11 years. In June 1631, John was knighted, then immediately was appointed the attorney to Prince Charles, later King Charles II. In 1634, he was made the Attorney General to the King. He would keep up this job and deal with many cases. When the Banks family eventually bought Corfe Castle after John's important promotion in 1634, maybe the reason for buying it was to match his newly regarded high status and the growth of the Banks family. They first sought to refurbish the site with the latest fashion and comfort, with later accounts suggesting that Persian and Turkish carpets, furniture, and paintings done by the artist Anthony van Dyck were all in the new family home. In 1642, tensions started to rise between Parliament and King Charles I over the control of the country. When civil war finally broke out on the 22nd of August, John Banks was summoned to York by orders of the King, whilst Mary and the children were forced to stay at home. For his loyalty to the King, John was labelled as a traitor, and as wife of a traitor, Mary Banks became scrutinised by the parliamentarians, and even started to seize her assets from £15,000 to just £1,000 per year. Throughout the winter months of 1642, Corfe Castle became a place of safety. However, by the new year, Mary received word of the parliamentarians burning and looting from royalist estates in the New Forest, and closing in fast. It was also at this point that most of the people in Dorset would start to side with Parliament. However, Corfe Castle still remained loyal to the king. Even though the Roundheads were closing in fast, Mary still wasn't intimidated as Parliament had hoped. Instead, on the 1st of May, she decided to keep spirits up by hosting the annual May Day stag hunt. Unfortunately, whilst out hunting in the Purbeck Forest with some of the gentlemen of Corfe Castle, she received word of the Roundheads approaching. In now knowing this, she raced back to the castle, getting there just minutes before the parliamentarians arrived. When the Roundheads finally appeared, a Sir Walter Erle, along with 300 men, demanded that Mary surrender the castle. Rather surprisingly though, she would refuse, and then order her maids, sons, daughters, and her guards to mount the castle's antique cannons and open fire at the enemies below. In return, Walter's army took surprisingly heavy fire from the old yet fierce cannon fire, so he and his men swiftly move on to the nearby coastal town of Poole to get reinforcements. Meanwhile, Mary would send the children away to their brother-in-law in Oxford for safety, and call for reinforcements herself. A captain by the name of Robert Lawrence answered Mary's plea for help by supplying an additional 80 men for the defence that was yet to come. On that same year, on June 28th, Sir Walter returned once more, this time with a much larger army of around 600 men and one new captain. They first started to fortify their position in the southwest around the rings, the same ones that Stephen built during his siege just 500 years before. To make matters worse for Mary, the parliamentarians started to burn and steal from the village. Even the church was burnt to the ground, with the lead from the building work being turned into gunpowder. Seeing that their homes were being destroyed, the villagers immediately fled to the gates of the castle. At this point, most of the garrison were at the West Bailey, dealing with large amounts of Roundheads firing off cannons and coming over the hilltop. However, over at the inner ward, Mary, along with her maids, witnessed the first siege ladders crashing at once into the castle walls, with parliamentarian troops rapidly climbing them. Wasting no time, Mary and her maids started to throw sharp stones and hot embers at the intruders below. After a total of just 6 weeks, Sir Walter, noticing that none of his troops were making it over the walls and taking heavy losses, he and his men once again retreated. Mary, along with the maids and the cavaliers, once again heroically defended Corfe Castle. In total, the parliamentarians lost just over 100 troops in their assault, whilst the royalists only sustained 2 casualties. Tales of Mary's bravery and defiance spread throughout the kingdom, gaining her the name Brave Dame Mary. Upon hearing the news of his wife's courageous defence, John was able to leave his duties in Oxford and celebrate with Mary. This would be where they would welcome their 14th child, William. Unfortunately, in January 1644, John returned to Oxford with the king, leaving Mary once again on her own. By the time summer had arrived, it was clear that the royalists were being defeated. Nearby, the towns of Wareham and Weymouth had fallen to the parliamentarians, whilst Corfe Castle remained the only stronghold between Exeter and London. Devastating news reached Mary that on the 28th of December 1644, her husband John had been killed in Oxford. This would obviously cause weakness in Mary's position, but the worst was yet to come. After 3 years, the country was tired of battles, and the destruction of the king's army at the Battle of Naseby in June 1645 ended in defeat. But back in Dorset, the royalists were not yet defeated. Sir Anthony Ashley Cooper, the first Earl of Shaftesbury, was ordered to draw together as much troops from the garrisons of Poole, Wareham, Lulworth and Weymouth in order to block up Corfe Castle. It took some time to round up the necessary forces, but in June, the parliamentarians finally got organised. The garrison of Corfe Castle were in the long process of grazing their animals outside the castle walls by day and bringing them in at night. Colonel Robert Butler led a small party from Wareham by night and hid within reach of the castle. While some of the party attacked the garrison, the rest rounded up the 140 cattle and 20 horses and herded them back to Wareham. In late December of that year, maybe the darkest day of Corfe Castle arrived, whereby it would eventually fall to parliamentarian forces, but not by means of sieging. Colonel Bingham, the military governor of Poole, took command of 2 fairly large regiments and proceeded to siege Corfe. Unfortunately, much like his predecessors, they were met with a fierce resistance from the castle's garrison. It seemed as if all hope was lost for the Roundheads, until something surprising happened. A member of Corfe Castle's own garrison, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Pitman, saw fit to secretly betray Marybanks by promising Parliament the castle in totality from within the walls in return for future protection. So on the night of the 26th of February 1646, 120 parliamentarians were let through the Sally Gate on the north-eastern corner of the castle. One force seized the keep, whilst the other dealt with the garrison. By early morning, a more substantial force of parliamentarians arrived. Mary, now with her home completely overrun and with all hope lost, was forced to surrender. Corfe Castle had finally been taken the next morning, on the 17th of February 1646, lasting nearly 4 years. Around 140 prisoners were taken, with 30 parliamentarians being freed. The Banks' luxurious furniture, carpets and paintings were all stolen, as well as other useful provisions such as food supplies. Nobody knows if Mary herself was imprisoned for a short while or simply let go. 7 days later, on the 5th of March 1646, Parliament ordered the demolition of Corfe Castle. Captain Thomas Hughes was given the long task of slighting it, lasting for months. As he pulled off these explosions, many of the villagers witnessed it fall. Sections of the curtain wall fell down, the towers were left tilting, the West Bailey became separated, and the 12th century keep was left torn apart. After its long destruction, Corfe Castle stone was either sold off to dealers or left exposed to stone robbers. As for the stolen furniture and art, Mary's eldest son Ralph tried to track down the people who had stolen it, where they usually ended up in large Dorset estates. Much like his father, Ralph went to train at the Gray's Inn, then later served under the newly restored King Charles II as a courtier. As for Mary, she was fined a total of £1,400, but having her strong determination, she set to reduce the penalty levy and regain her demolished estate. This petition took many years, but finally Parliament granted brave Dame Mary her land back for her courage and strong defiance. She was also presented the keys to the castle, of which can still be seen today at the bank's new home of Kingston, Lacey. After her strong petition, Mary retired to East Court Manor, where she died on April 11th, 1661, just a year after the restoration of the monarchy. In my opinion, she was one of the most extraordinary women in the history of England, who not only fought to defend her home, but for the king. Corfe Castle and Kingston Lacey remained in the Banks family until 1981, when Henry John Ralph Banks died. The estate and ruins were both left to the National Trust. Corfe Castle has been the site of a king's murder, a place of luxury, wealth and imprisonment, and a site of sieges. In my opinion, Corfe Castle is one of the most historical and fascinating fortresses in England. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please consider liking and subscribing.